This is an audio course. Thank you for listening.
Your book's called Time Rich, which sounds like an awesome thing I'd like to be. Can you tell us, what does it mean to be time rich?
Really means living life according to your values. It doesn't necessarily mean that you wake up in the morning and you spend all day in your underwear watching Netflix. It really comes back to having the time to invest your hours, your very few hours, into things that give you a more rewarding experience of life. So for some people, that might be working longer hours. For some people, it might be spending more time with family. But ultimately, I think it comes back to how you choose to spend those hours and spending those hours on high value activities.
Well, that sounds like the ideal. Can you tell us kind of what's the state of affairs right now in terms of how many of us really do that?
Very few of us do that. I think typical person now is spending about 12 hours a day staring at screens. But if you look at what we're spending our time doing with those screens, particularly now when it comes to work, people's way of work, we're effectively taking what we did in the office, which was 50 to 60 interruptions a day, which was 40 to 50 notifications, push notifications popping up on our screen all day long, which was responding to emails within 5 minutes of them being received, checking email every 6 minutes. We've taken that and we've just put it all online. Like instead of a 1 hour face-to-face meeting, it's a 1 hour Zoom call. Instead of taps on the shoulder all day long, it's a Slack message. And it's actually worse now because we've got that Slack channel or the Microsoft Teams channel up all day long and the red light's always going off, new notification. So we're bouncing back into that all day long. And what that does for us in terms of our focus, effectively, we're paying a cognitive switching penalty because every time we switch tasks, it can take us up to 23 minutes to get back in the zone. And, when we're in the zone, when we cultivate the ability to get into flow, we're about 5 times more productive. When we're totally immersed on one task, the rest of the world seems to fade away and the hours just fly by. We're way more productive. But we're in this state of hyper responsiveness where nothing gets done and we can be busy, quote unquote, all day long, but have very little to show for it come the end of the day. And just to close the loop on your question, Gallup ran a study last year which found that 85% of people are either disengaged or not engaged by their work. So only 15% of us are engaged by our work, which comes back to these organizational cultures where either we're not aligned with the values of the organization or we're just not given a sense of control to actually get stuff done because we're spending all day long in meetings, we're being interrupted all day long, and, we're glorifying things like inbox zero, which demonstrates that we're really good at responding to other people's demands on our time at the expense of our own priorities. So my sense is that very, very few people are doing the utmost with what little time they're given.
Now, you mentioned that it can take up to 23 minutes for us to get into the zone when we switch tasks, which sounds familiar, like the Microsoft study with email. Is that where that came from?
That actually comes from an organization called Advanced Brain Monitoring in the United States, who ran a study on the flow state. It also echoes a study that McKinsey ran, a 10-year study around high executives, where they found that when these executives are in the flow state, they're up to 5 times more productive. There's also another study that Advanced Brain Monitoring ran where they found that even micro task switches, so a notification pops up on your smartphone and you see it, but you don't tap on it. You just notice it. That 1/10 of a second micro task switch over the course of a day, they've found that can add up to about a 40% productivity loss. Because even if you're in flow and you notice that, that's enough to kind of take you out of flow and it's going to take you time to get back in. Not only does it compromise our productivity, but this constant sort of recalibrating our minds around a different thing, it can leave us exhausted as well. So we can find that by, say, 1 p.m., we're feeling spent just because we've spent the first 4-5 hours of our day just shuffling between browser windows madly instead of just focusing on that one high-value activity.
So tell me, what are the best interventions, super habits, practices, tips, and tricks for those of us who want to cut out the time poor behavior and be all the more time rich?
Sure. So a good visual mnemonic that will help your audience is tire. So I say when it comes to our own personal productivity, we're carrying around spare tires, which effectively slow us down. So the T stands for task switching. So best thing you can do there, actionable step, is you turn off your notifications. That's a really easy one. But the second one is really cultivating the ability to focus on one thing for extended periods of time. So using something like a Freedom app or a block site to block Twitter, to block these apps that you're inclined to jump into, and then just, let me just quickly check my notifications. And that can send you down a Twitter rabbit hole for half an hour. The other thing there is also the browser windows. Like rather than having 20 browser windows open, just focus on one. So these are like some actionable things you can do in terms of that environment. And then the other thing I would do on task switching is, it's like cultivating any habit. Like if you're not used to going to the gym, it can take you a while to get into that. But cultivating the ability to sit still on one task for 30 to 60 minutes without switching, that also takes effort. So you might want to start with, say, 15 minutes and work your way up. Environment design is important too. If you want to build new habits, cultivating an environment where it's easy to build that new habit, where it's easier to break bad ones as well. So I've touched on a couple of them there, but also if I have my phone right next to my desk and I was going to reach for it, but I don't have it here, which speaks to what I'm trying to communicate, it's much easier for me to pick up that phone and just check Instagram quickly and do things like that. So whatever you can do to build an environment free of distraction, do that.
So there's 30 to 60 minutes of not switching, and you say that could be hard. We might need to start with 15. I think maybe it might be beneficial to paint a picture in terms of when we say not switching. I have a feeling you have a higher standard of this than most of us. So can you give us an example of when you say, okay, hey, for the next 15, 30, 60 minutes, I'm doing this and only this. What could be some examples? And then what are we not doing? We're not looking at any notification or ding or beep or buzz whatsoever, or visiting any place. Paint a picture for us.
Yeah, definitely. So if I am writing 1,000-word article, I am not checking my phone. I am not checking other websites. There are no notifications popping up on my screen. I'm focusing purely on the task of writing. Now, there may be, while I'm writing, I might need, say, a reference of some kind to help me elaborate on things. But I'm going to go through one round first. So if there is a reference that I'm looking for, I might just make a note of that in the article and write reference, highlight it in yellow, and keep on going. Because if I stop every 50 words to seek out references, that can slow things down. I want to write it first and then go off and do those other things, because in a world of 4 million blog posts being published every day, it's so easy for us to get stuck in content rabbit holes. And again, we need to be honest with ourselves, because it can be easy to conflate doing stuff with being productive, because ultimately we derive a lot of self-worth from our work, but we need to make sure that we're deriving that self-worth from, productive activities rather than just stuff that makes us feel busy. So that's essentially my definition of not task switching, which is really focusing on not just the one task, but also what's the task within the task. Because writing, could be researching, could be fact checking. There are different elements to that value chain of writing, but focusing on that one task within the value chain of writing at a time.
Yeah, I really like that a lot. The task within the task. And then I guess that's where things get tricky, is when you need to get something else to do the thing you're doing, whether it's inside your email or whether it's inside a reference or whether it's inside your phone text message history. That's what trips me up in terms of like, oh, I need to get this thing in order to finish what I'm doing. But then as I go to that other place, I'm besieged with all the other stuff and I hate it. How do I fix it?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And in some cases, you might get to a point where, look, it's a dead end and I need to jump into my email to get this widget, to get this attachment, whatever it is, to continue with my work. So of course, you need to do that. Now, I would say that in some cases, there are tools that exist. So for example, if I need to quickly write an email, but I don't want to be besieged by all of my new incoming emails, well, there's widgets like, plugins rather, like Google Chrome's Compose Email plugin, which will just open the Compose Email window. So that way I spare myself seeing my inbox. Or it might be that, if I'm jumping into my inbox to get an attachment, well, in that case, I might see those other things coming in. So at the same time, I think it comes back to building that muscle and cultivating the ability to be like, hey, I see you email, but right now I'm working on this other thing and I'll get back to you later. So that comes back to nothing new. I mean, people have talked about batching before, but really batching the checking of email to say 3 times a day is something I talk about in the book, where a study showed that once people check email more than 3 times a day, their sort of emotional well-being starts to fall off with it. Like there was like an inverse correlation. The more times you check email throughout the day and how good you feel kind of tapers off. So batching that, whether it's morning, midday, end of the day, and just having that time specifically for checking and responding to those emails is better than sporadically doing it throughout the day. Now, there's probably all sorts of reasons why people feel worse off when they do that. It might be just that they're spending all day on shallow level tasks. They're not getting any high value work done. And that could be part of it. It's kind of like, Netflix is all well and good, but if you spend 4 hours binging a TV series, you feel terrible at the end of it. Like it's just shallow level work. You get into sort of a vegetative state, and it can be that would also happen with our email as well.
So now could we hear about the why part of the TIRE acronym?
So the Roman philosopher Seneca once said that people are frugal when it comes to guarding their personal property, but not so when it comes to their time, which is the one thing which is it is right to be stingy with, because time, unlike money, cannot be earned back once you spend it. So why essentially stands for yes, saying yes to all sorts of demands on our time, oftentimes at the expense of our own thing, because as human beings, we have a tendency, well, not a tendency, we have a predisposition to wanting to be liked. So if someone requests something of us, we say yes. If someone sends us a meeting request, in most organizations, it's expected that you will say yes, and that if you say no, well, that's going to create a bit of tension there between you and that person that invited you. But every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to everything else. So there is a lot of narrative, if you will, in particularly the startup ecosystem, where they say, you say yes to everything, it creates serendipity. And that's true. But at the same time, you're saying yes to one thing and you're saying no to everything else. So being more diligent about what we say yes to and making sure that stuff really aligns with our goals is going to help us get close to those goals. But the one other thing that I would say on that is, when it comes to meetings, for example, at Basecamp, if you want to book a meeting in someone else's calendar, you just can't do that. You need to sell the meeting to them. You need to, why is their contribution going to be valuable at this meeting? Whereas in many organizations, there is just this tendency to just call every man, woman, and their dog to a meeting, and you have 10 people sitting around a Zoom call nowadays, when really you might only need 2 or 3 people to be there. One example I can talk of there is Dominic Price, who is the resident work futurist at Atlassian. So he uses this really useful visual of boomerang and stick. So his calendar was basically back-to-back meetings all day long, all week long. And after a while, he said, look, I can't keep working like this. I can't work on my own goals. And I'm just not finding that my time is really optimized attending all of these meetings. So he started saying no. And 2/3 of those meetings didn't come back. So they were effectively sticks. He sent back the meeting rejection and didn't come back. 1/3 did, and he called them boomerangs. So it might be that 2/3 of the meetings that you're attending yourself, particularly if you work at a larger organization, could be proverbial sticks, if you will. And just by saying no, you might save, as was the case with Dominic Price, 15 hours a week that you can reinvest into your own stuff as well.
Well, that's really inspiring, because I think you said perfectly earlier, yes, there's this fear associated with, if I say no to this meeting request, I'm going to create some friction, some tension. And it sounds like that was not the case for Dominique in terms of just a no. I was like, oh, okay. And then the 1/3 was like, no, seriously, I really need you. It was like, all right then. And so that's a pretty simple filter then right there. And do you have any pro tips on how we'd recommend saying that no?
Yeah, definitely. So rather than just saying, no, I will not attend your meeting, it's not of value to me, it comes back to human psychology, trying to empathize with that person, make sure that they understand your own position as well, and say, look, I'm currently working on XYZ. It's a high priority for me. I need to get it done by then. I don't think that my presence at this meeting will be of value, but if there's anything I can share that you think is valuable, I'm happy to email that along. If you think for whatever reason that I absolutely have to be at this meeting, let me know why and I'll come along. So it's just about I suppose, taking the edges off somewhat and just being human with your rejection.
Okay, so we got the T, we got the Y. What's the R?
Residual work. So many of your audience will be familiar with Forrest Gump. And there's this classic scene in Forrest Gump where he's playing college football and he's running towards the end zone. He gets there, he's got the touchdown, and he just keeps on running right into the change rooms. He takes out one of the band members on his way there. And this is essentially how we tend to approach a lot of our work, where we don't stop at the point of diminishing returns. We just keep on going. And so we might spend, say, 4 hours putting together a sales presentation, but then we might spend another 4 hours working with the formatting, making it absolutely quote unquote perfect at the expense of just saying, okay, we've created most of the value. Let's stop. Let's move on to something else. And so high performers tend to have a good relationship with that point of diminishing returns. And this is something that I find myself doing sometimes as well. And often it comes back to doing something that's familiar, that's comfortable, and that gives us that sense of being busy again at the expense of starting something new. Because when it comes to switching and starting a task afresh, something that's perhaps somewhat challenging, our brain needs to recalibrate around that. It's like staring at a blank page. You can get writer's block or coder's block or whatever block is associated with your work. And the way around that, again, comes back to just breaking that up to its smallest possible unit and getting started on that and getting those wheels rolling, because that comes back to Isaac Newton and his first law of motion. An object at rest stays at rest. An object in motion stays in motion, which effectively means that once that ball is rolling, the amount of energy you need to apply to keep it rolling is much less than what's required to get it started in the first place. So when you do find that you are at that point of diminishing returns, stop, maybe go for a 20-minute walk, because that helps us release some BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like our caveman brain sensing movement as a fight or flight moment. And that helps us focus. So taking that walk, coming back and starting on that fresh task, breaking it down to its smallest requisite part, getting that ball in motion. And once it's in motion, it's so much easier to do that. And the benefit of this is we're not talking about this over one day, but if you do that over, say, 100 days, you've saved yourself countless hours just kind of tweaking stuff, inconsequential activities that you do on a task long after it's been done. And you've actually spent a lot more time working on high value activities. So the compounding interest benefit, if you will, over long periods of time is significant.
And so what are some telltale signs that you are approaching or have hit or have passed this point of diminishing returns?
You've got to be objective based on your own work. So it's hard to answer that without knowing the kind of work that people are working on. Like, yes, there is value in, say, writing an article and then going over it, making sure it's spell checked and it sounds good and everything else. But once you've done that once or twice, you might just find yourself scrolling up and down and just looking at it, ad infinitum. And that's perhaps the point where you want to move on and go to something else, because it really depends on individual task at hand. You might find yourself, if you work in social media, you might spend a bit of time putting together some content, and then you'll go off and you'll publish it. And then you might just find that you're spending too much time refreshing the screen and seeing what kind of engagement you're getting. Now that's, past the point of diminishing returns. People who work in social media will say, well, that's part of my job. But like the email, you can batch that. You don't need to be doing that, refreshing the page every 5 minutes. And then just while you're there, checking out some of the other things that have been posted, going into your analytics and doing all these little inconsequential things that perhaps you should be batching once a day, and then moving on to another activity. So again, that comes back to that sort of the value chain of work. What is the nature of your work? What's the value chain even within a task? And batching that stuff rather than finding yourself in this hamster on a wheel mode. And the value in that case was creating the content, publishing it, and that's it. But refreshing the page ad infinitum, that obviously isn't a high value activity.
Okay, so we got the T, the Y, the R, and the E.
So the E essentially, I suppose, dovetails off something we touched on, which was the path of least effort. So human beings, biologically, we're predisposed to taking the path of least effort. I mean, that comes back to evolutionary wiring, whereby tens of thousands of years ago, when we were naked running around the African savannah, we didn't know where our food would come from. And so we needed to conserve energy for extended periods of time in case we needed to hunt out some prey or evade some predators. This now shows up in our work when we sit down to our desks and we take that path of least effort, checking Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. And we already touched on some of the ways to circumvent that by breaking things down to the residual parts, environment design, and cultivating the ability to get stuck on the most difficult task, perhaps first thing in the morning or first thing in the afternoon, whenever it is you tend to do your best work, which is something we touched on in the book as well, which is that about 50% of people are actually night owls, which means they do their best work 10 hours after waking. Otherwise, if you try and get a night owl to work an hour after waking, they actually suffer from a form of social jet lag, which can also predispose them to developing anxiety and depression over the longer term. So this whole idea of getting people to the office at, say, 9 a.m., getting them out of bed at 7, particularly if they're night owls, it's really detrimental to their health, but not only their health, but their ability to perform at a high level. So, when you think about the fact that about 50% of the population are night owls, like they have these preferred sleeping patterns, but they're forced to get to work early. I think it's encouraging to see that now with the move to remote work at scale, hopefully more organizations stay that way. It does create the conditions to move to more asynchronous communication, where we're not expecting real-time responses, where we're not conflating presence with productivity, and people aren't expected to be on Slack all day long and expected to all be on these back-to-back Zoom calls. It does give people the ability to design days as it best suits them, as it best suits their biological predisposition, the realities of their lives, their families and everything else, so that they can get work when it best suits them. And ultimately, like that benefits everyone. It also benefits the organizations, because if you can create those types of cultures, it also is a compelling recruitment tool, because people want to work at places where they can create their own days as it best suits them, but also work in organizations where they can actually get stuff done and not be bogged down by bucket loads of process and policy that just gives them no sense of control or agency over their work.
Well, so I also know you've got a take on the 8-hour workday. Lay it on us. Are shorter workdays better, and why?
Sure. So shorter workdays, there is no yes or no answer. Ultimately, the 6-hour workday experiment, something we ran 2.5 years ago, and I wrote an article about this for Harvard Business Review called The Case for the 6-Hour Workday. And what you find is when you have a shorter workday, if you're an organization that has a lot of bloat, that isn't intentional about how it goes about creating value, shorter workday forces you to focus on high value activities. It's a forcing function. So one, it will force you to, say, automate and outsource rudimentary, process-oriented, lower-risk activities so that your people aren't doing that. 2, it will force you to focus on, say, high-value tasks. So applying the Pareto principle, focusing in on those 20% of tasks that create the majority of the value, rather than just focusing on those low-value tasks that feel good, that you've done because you've always done them before, but don't really move the needle forward. It forces people to cultivate the flow state, to get better at getting into that deep work state, to do away with those notifications, those distractions, and those meetings that inhibit our ability to do our best work. So a shorter workday will help you in that regard. So if you do have a lot of bloat and you're working at 8-hour workdays and you come back to 6, you will find more productivity. Now, over the past couple of years, there's been a trend as well to 4-day work weeks. We saw Microsoft Japan run a 4-day work week, and they suggested that their productivity improved by 40%. Now, me personally, I would argue that 5 shorter work days is better than, say, 4 longer ones, because if you have created this environment and culture where people can get into flow and people can do that for, say, the max amount of time, which is about 4 hours a day, maybe 5, then if you're keeping them there for, say, 8 hours for 4 days a week, that suggests that maybe there's 2 or 3 hours of waste there, rather than running, say, 5 days at 4 or 5 hours a day, which I think is more beneficial if people are spending that time in flow. Now, again, there's something to be said about not all hours will be in flow. Like, for example, you may have to have some meetings. There is collaboration that's required at organizations. There are things that need to get done where you're just not working in isolation. So that's why adding maybe a couple of hours to that workday, so it's 6 hours rather than just 4, I think makes sense.
Okay. And you mentioned automation and outsourcing. Do you have any favorite tools or services or tricks here?
Yeah, look, I think Zapier for me is probably one of the most powerful ones. So Zapier, or IFTTT, which stands for if this, then that. So these tools will basically help different tools speak to each other. So recently during the pandemic, I spun off a media company called No Filter. And one thing we found was taking up a lot of time was getting people that we had paid to take Google Docs that our writers had developed and take them, copy them, paste them into our CMS and publish that. So we created a very simple automation between, say, a HTML form and our CMS, so that our writers would just plug the content right into the HTML form, and that would get picked up by Zapier and come into our CMS. So then us as editors, we just jump into that CMS and we just need to publish it, or we might need to just make some changes if we feel like the content's not good enough. But that saves us a lot of time copying and pasting, but it also meant that we could operate at scale, because then we could reach out to a lot of different writers and say, hey, if you want to write for us, here's the online form. And that just helps us make the process a lot more seamless. So that's one. Another example is tools like Repurpose, which help you effectively repurpose content for different platforms. So you can think about something like recording a Facebook Live video and then using a combination of tools like Zapier, Repurpose, Recurpost, for example, where that Facebook Live video could get turned into a transcribed blog post, an audiogram, a YouTube video, and social media posts with the click of a button, essentially. Another couple of tools people might want to look out for WebMerge and Airtable. So, I mentioned earlier sales presentations. We used Airtable to automate our sales proposal generation, right? So rather than having to manually seek out, hey, where's that proposal we prepared for that client about 6 months ago, getting that PowerPoint or Keynote, and then manually putting that together, we've created this tool where all we do is plug in the prospect's name, their logo, and choose the color scheme, and also just choose what products they're actually interested in. And this will spit out a presentation that we might spend 5-10 minutes customizing. And over the course of the year, that also saves us a bunch of time when it comes to just automating these rudimentary process-oriented tasks. So I would challenge people that whatever task you're currently working on, like whether it's customer service, sales, marketing, testing, administrative tasks, like so many things can be automated, and the cost of doing so is not high. But a lot of people will say things like, yeah, but I haven't got time or money to do that. But that's kind of ironic, because over the long term, you actually end up spending a lot more time and money trying to do it yourself, rather than just spending that time up front, which will pay itself back in orders of magnitude.
Oh, yeah. That's what I found. It's like, it's not so much that you don't have time. It's just that it's kind of hard and tiring to figure it out and execute it and set it up. But once you do, yeah, I've had many instances of set up a system and a process with a combination of training someone to do something and software doing something and bring them together. And I spend 2 hours and it saves me 40 hours. And there's not a lot of 20-to-1 returns to be had in your investments. But when it comes to time and automation outsourcing, there's many to be done.
Many. One quick one there, just on, that 20-to-1. If you look at things like 5-minute tasks done 5 times a day, like if you just outsource that task or automate it, that saves people something like 15 days over the course of the year. Like if you extrapolate that 5 minutes out, and that's just that 5 minutes, like we're not even accounting for the fact that you need to stop what you're doing to do that task and then come back to what you were doing. So the task switching as well. So it doesn't need to be a big task to save a lot of time. But if it's a small task that you're doing often, like even a 5-minute task, think about outsourcing that as well.